Hello and welcome to Dystopian Deep Dives. It is Wednesday, January 15th, 2025 at 8 p.m. So I just read this piece in Vulture about Neil Gaiman, or is it Gaiman? I'm really not sure how to pronounce it. But I just read this and I had covered this on my other channel, WitchyXX, when the Tortoise podcast came out, which is referenced in this piece. And I'll just put it on the screen real quick here. This is the piece I am referring to, this Vulture piece in New York Magazine, which sadly does not condemn the practice of BDSM, and in fact wants to really draw a delineation between the practice of BDSM, the so-called practice of BDSM, like it's some kind of art, like it's gross the way that we've engaged in this newspeak. And I've always said about, BDSM is, especially when I was doing more radical feminist content, was that it's not normal, and it's been totally normalized in our culture by people like Alfred Kinsey, who was very much an admirer of Aleister Crowley. And we'll get into more of that in a little bit, but it's not normal, and it's totally an excuse, I think, for sadists to abuse people, while also being a proxy for self-harm when we're referring to the masochistic side of the equation. So I entitled this as Neil Gaiman a Demon. And if I'm saying it wrong, just tell me I am, and I'll start calling him Gaiman. I'm really not sure. I'm not a fan. I've never been a fan of this kind of stuff. Comic book stuff really, it's just so adolescent to me, adult people being into comic books. I did read comic books when I was a teenager. I had a friend whose older brother was really into comic books, and I ended up reading um, and buying most of Transmetropolitan, which I don't know where it went, but I had all of it because that was really interesting to me. And maybe someday I'll do a show on it. But yeah, comic books and the whole comic book sort of idea, the Marvel, there's a lot of occult situations going on. In fact, like Doctor Strange was created by Steve Ditko, who was an active OTO member, according to James Wasserman's book, his memoir. So I feel like there are just a lot of connections. And I also feel like this sort of ties into my idea of perma-adolescence, right? We've created a culture of perma-adolescence in which no one really has to grow up. Everyone can just act on impulse, do as thou wilt. Basically, also, speaking of Crowley, the Aeon of Horus is basically an Aeon of a child god. So, and you got to wonder, after reading this piece, you really, really have to wonder. So back to this tweet that I took a screenshot of, which I think really sums it up for me. This comes from an account called Moniza Hossein. I don't know who that is, but she says, I've seen the grok prompts about how the claims of abuse have not been proven, and I just say that it doesn't even matter. You cannot have a consensual BDSM relationship with your homeless employee whose pay you've been withholding. That's not a thing. And again, this piece here in New York Magazine really wants to try to separate this idea of the so-called practice of BDSM with abuse, right? I just don't think there really is a line that you can draw. This community, so-called community, makes all sorts of excuses for terrible things that, as a healthy culture, and I believe a more moral culture, would completely condemn. And I do believe that this is the influence of Aleister Crowley on our culture. I think it has a lot to do with it. I think this idea of doing whatever you want shall be the whole of the law is a really dangerous one. And it's completely a reversal of any kind of moralistic society that you would want to create, because I'm sorry, but a working society must have a moral code. It must. Or else it's not going to work. So, yeah, that's just sort of what I have off the cuff. So I wrote on my notes here, is he a demon? The short answer is yes. And so I'm sharing some Twitter screenshots of images I took. This was interesting. James Gufford writes, remember when a group of his fans on Reddit talked about not discussing the allegations and ignoring the controversies so they could continue to like his work? LOL, Reddit's Neil Gaiman board is banning all discussion of him allegedly liking rough, non-consensual sex and instead only allowing discussion of his work. I guess we'll soon be seeing the R. Hitler subreddit shifting its focus to an art appreciation thread. Yeah, so let me share that image. Hello, everyone. I wanted to take this opportunity to provide some updates regarding the direction of our community. After carefully considering all the feedback received, I have decided to shift the focus of the sub from Neil and his personal life to solely his work. And this is one of these stories that really dings on my bells, right? Is art separated from the artist? I really don't believe there is a delineation that comes out of this person's mind. And we'll review some of his art, his so-called artwork in a moment. But this decision was not made lightly, and I spent considerable time pondering this matter. Consequently, you may have noticed some changes, such as the removal of Neil's face as the sub's avatar, the retirement of the good Gaiman flair, and some adjustments to the rules. I have also archived older posts and updated the auto mod. This also means the response thread will now be closed. It's important to note that this change is not intended to discourage discussions about Neil's life or the significance of biographical context in his work. Instead, it aims to foster meaningful analysis and critique of his work within those contexts, along with other forms of literary criticism. In arriving at this decision, I sought guidance from Reddit, and that's where the image cuts off. So this must have been sometime in the summer of last year when these allegations first came to the surface through mostly that Tortoise podcast, but other reporting on it. I didn't really have time to listen to the podcast, but personally, I would rather read a long piece like this because I feel like it's more interactive and I can take notes on the paper and highlight things. So, yeah, that's my excuse for not listening to the podcast. Julie Bindel, who's quite a famous UK feminist who has stuck her neck out on the trans issue quite a bit historically, says, I'm going to stick my neck out here and say explicitly what we are all thinking. No, Neil Gaiman had an arrangement with his ex-wife Amanda Palmer to supply victims to him, and the blue fringe polyqueer brigade that worships them both don't know what to do with it all. Yeah, and this entire piece cannot condemn the practice of BDSM and goes through great lengths here in Vulture to, draw that line. And I just will repeat myself, there is no line. It's not normal. Okay. And so the piece is called Call Me Master, but I actually thought about, entitling my YouTube video this quote about how he demanded that this one woman promise him her soul. So in this piece, it says, as soon as they began to hook up, the feeling that had drawn her to him, the magical spell of his interest in her individuality vanished. He seemed to have a script, she tells me. He wanted me to call him master immediately. He demanded that she promise him her soul. it was like he'd gone into this ritual and that it had nothing to do with me. So, is he a demon or is it his Scientology background? This piece was fascinating for me because I didn't really know all of this about him. Again, I'm not really a fan of his, and he admires Alan Moore, who also has connections to the OTO. And even if they're not practicing the dark occult, they sure seem to be doing a lot of deranged things and trying to normalize depravity. I think Crowley would be very proud to see what has happened up until this point in 2025. So, wait, just speaking of Crowley, here we go. The current Aeon, right, according to Telema, is known as the Aeon of Horus, and it is believed to have begun in 1904 with the reception of the Book of the Law, which Crowley maintained was dictated to him by a being called Iwas. The Aeon of Horus, which looks like a gray alien, by the way, if you're not familiar. The Aeon of Horus, frequently referred to as simply the Aeon and symbolized by the child god Horus, is seen as a time of greater consciousness, individual sovereignty, and spiritual awakening, right? Lucifer is the great rebellion, right? He's the individual, he's the savior. You are going to model your life after doing what you want. Yeah. Which is, I think, very childish, isn't it? And even I think some children behave better than adults. Anyway, Telemites believe that this aeon represents a departure from the constraints and dogmas of the previous aeon, particularly the influence of the Abrahamic religions, and heralds of a self-actualization, an era of this, and the realization of human potential. Okay. So Neil Gaiman was raised in the Church of Scientology by two very prominent, according to this article, very prominent UK Scientologists. And eventually, his father had become so powerful that the Miscavige group, the people who had rallied, like once Hubbard dies, Miscavige sort of swoops in. David Miscavige, by the way, where is Shelley Miscavige? If you know anything about that, if you're following that, that's like crazy to me that the wife of the leader of Scientology just appears to be missing for years. Anyways, so Miscavige kind of swoops in, and there was a lot of political hubbub, and actually Neil Gaiman's father was labeled as a suppressive person, likely by the Miscavige sort of group of Scientologists. And you got to wonder about Neil Gaiman's childhood, who this writer in Vulture mentions, that he had written this book. I guess it's one of his more recent books, but it's a book about this boy who, let me go ahead. Let me try to find it in the article. But basically, it's a boy who's abused in a bathtub. And it becomes very interesting that there's a bathtub on Neil Gaiman's property. And this is the first instance of abuse by him towards their babysitter, which I believe Amanda Palmer put in danger knowingly. When the babysitter finally told her what had happened, what had transpired, Amanda Palmer's like, oh, it's 14, people have told me this before already. I've had to do this before. Like, lady, you knew what you were doing and you sent her to the house alone. And I just think all of these sort of accounts from her friends are pure bullshit. Like, I think Amanda Palmer knew full well what she was doing. Neil Gaiman even said, I wish it was like the old days, like when they used to, I believe, have group sex. So I think I'm hitting everything I'm wanting to talk about. I do have notes, but I'm sort of just winging it. I just think Amanda Palmer's totally complicit. And I want to mention that this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. These are only my opinions, okay? Not reporting this as fact, but I just do believe that it's likely, very likely, that Amanda Palmer was highly complicit. It's like, I think some people on Twitter were saying it's like Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, but for like goths. Right. So let me see what else I have going on in my notes here. I wrote that next to this quote in the piece. Let me try to find it. Tight knit. Right. So Palmer, an obsessive chronicler of her own life in songs, poems, blog posts, and a memoir, got her start as half of the punk cabaret band, the Dresden Dolls, who I always thought were really corny. When like a dude would put them on in his car, I'd be like, all right, this date is over. Anyway, but she is perhaps more famous for her ability to attract a tight-knit and devoted following wherever she goes. And I wrote next to that cult leader narc. And she has this sort of parasocial relationship. They both do with their fans. Palmer explained in her book, The Art of Asking, part memoir, part manifesto, on the virtues of asking for assistance of various kinds. She had built her entire career on messy exchanges of goodwill and the swapping of favors. Out of this mess, she argues, a utopian sort of community formed. Okay. There was no distinction between fans and friends, right? So to me, that sounds very cult-like, a cult of personality, a parasocial relationship that these people have. And indeed, this woman who she put in danger, if you haven't read the article, named Scarlett, was a huge fan and actually met her on the street while she was in Melbourne. No, they were in New Zealand. I would have to look at it. Anyway, they're in New Zealand and they meet on the street. And basically, Amanda Palmer's like, will you be the nanny for me? Will you be my nanny? And she's like, yeah. So she gets sent to this house that's on an island for rich people, basically. You have to take a ferry over there. And she goes over there and it's this house in the woods. And Neil is there and the child is actually on a play date. Like, this all sounds really weird, right? Start your first date. The kid's not even going to be there, but Neil will. Like, what you knew. And so she goes over there and she gets into this, bathtub that's out back because Neil insisted that she use it. And about 5 minutes later, he pops in there and starts basically molesting this young woman. So I think she really put this babysitter in danger on purpose. Other artists also have called her a grifter. And let's see what else I have. There's like a really messed up power dynamic, right? Where you can't just, again, back to this tweet, like hire someone, not pay them. And, it's just disgusting. There's no such thing as consent here. This is a decent post, even though I really don't believe consensual BDSM exists. I just think it's an excuse for abuse. I wrote overrated near Neil Gaiman, another note that I had. I'm just looking at the printout that I did. So yeah, she gets drunk. So Gaiman poured, let me try to find it. Oh, sorry, I'm hitting my microphone with my paper. All right. Where did I go? Well, I guess it's right here. Gaiman poured Pavlovic a glass of rosé and then another. He drank only water. And I had highlighted that and I wrote classic, get her drunk. And I also feel like this is not the first time this has happened. I just don't. I think Amanda Palmer had sent other women there. So when he arrived at the bath, she saw that he was naked. He stretched out facing her, and for a few moments or minutes made small talk. Get comfortable. He looked at her again and said, don't ruin the moment. She did as instructed, and he began to stroke her feet. At that point, she recalls she felt a subtle terror. The next part is really amorphous, Pavlovich tells me. But I can tell you that he put his fingers, and this is graphic, straight into my ASS and tried to put his penis in my ASSS. And he said, call me master and I'll come. And he said, be a good girl. You're a good little girl. And what's really creepy is I saw that Amanda Palmer did this video of a mashup of Blurred Lines and Rape Me. And there's a part in the song where they're saying good girl. She's like screaming good girl. And it's just, I don't know. I just think we're looking at two really messed up people who also probably practice the dark arts. Like you're on Dystopian Deep Dives. I don't know what else you want from me. Amanda told me I couldn't have you, she recalls him saying. As soon as he'd heard this, he knew he had to have her. God, he continued, I wish it were the good old days where we could both F you. My note is, what? So I just think this happened all the time. Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein for goths. So I wrote on this next page, they're always telling on themselves through their work. So speaking of that, let's take a look. Let's take a look at this. So I've never read any of his comic books, full disclosure. I always thought he was really corny. And I just really, I'm not really into this stuff. And I think it's just, again, sort of this overarching culture of permanent adolescence. Anyway, so this is a comic book. I don't remember. I guess it says which one it is in this thread here. We'll share this one instead. Okay, so this is John Del Eras, who I guess is some kind of Christian pop culture gaming guy. I don't know. Okay, but this is a good thread. So here's his work, The Sandman. Okay, so this is The Sandman, which the writer in Vulture writes about too, this sort of fictional character that everyone thinks is Neil writing himself into his own work. So people hailed him for his dark and edgy content. So this is in The Sandman, and basically what happens is there's a writer that has writer's block that gets who is it, Calliope? Yeah. As his muse, basically locks her in the basement and completely abuses her and rapes her. Yeah, we think this is probably him writing himself into his own work. So let me just go ahead and share this. So this is from The Sandman. What would you with me now, Erasmus? Am I now to perform for your amusement? Is this man to be our audience? Don't get yourself worked up, Calliope. No, this is Richard Maddock. He's a novelist, or at least he's written one extremely successful first novel and has found himself quite unable to write anything else. Richard, this is Calliope, the youngest of the 9 muses. She was Homer's muse, so she ought to be good enough for you. Calliope, I'm giving you to Richard. You're his now. But you promised, or you said you promised that you would free me before you died. You said I could have my freedom. Put not your trust in princes, my dear, nor an aging author who has never been what one might call a shining example when it came to keeping his word. Writers are liars, and you should always believe people when you tell they're always showing you. That's why I really just don't think you can separate the art from the artist. Anyway, writers are liars, my dear. Surely you have realized that by now. Take the little con away, Maddock. I never want to see either of you again. However, if you ever happen to feel a spark of gratitude, you might want to persuade some publisher to bring Here Comes a Candle back into print. I was particularly proud of that one. Okay, and so this is from one of his comic books. Let's share this. We'll go back to this. His books features strange degeneracy as well. American Gods has a scene where a man gets his penis bit off when a car gets crashed, as well as a giant spider creature that swallows someone with her vagina, which really just sounds like hatred of women to me. Uh, and indeed, when we're talking about dark arts, when we're talking about Telema or Aleister Crowley, we have people like Kenneth Anger saying, this is not a religion for women. Okay, they have to basically do these rituals with women, but they believe it's to siphon off, their power. It's kind of really ironic that they have to use women in these rituals, when indeed they, I think, really just hate them. The first allegation comes from a babysitter, Scarlett Pavlovich, who is it Pavlovich or something else? Anyway, so I already mentioned this, right? And I'm not going to read all of it, but yes, it's true. Lick her own feces and beat her with a belt to get himself off. Abused several young fans. One woman said he brought her back to his tour bus and asked to put his fingers inside of her. When she told him no, he allegedly raped her. And yeah, this story was terrible. There was a woman that lived on his property, um, who he forced into sexual situations. So he really has this sort of make someone or meet someone extremely vulnerable and take total advantage of their situation in life, make them totally and completely dependent on you, which is completely psychopathic behavior, but it's also a very well-known pattern of abusive men, who they will find women at their most vulnerable point in life and, basically get with them and then abuse them. So his ex-wife, Amanda Palmer, right, because they were going through a messy divorce as well at the time, allegedly because of this. But Amanda Palmer describes that when they met, she didn't even like him. They didn't even like each other at first. They just basically decided to do an art project together. And I really think it was sort of a transactional kind of marriage. And he said, like the old days. And so I just think she used to bring women to him and they, would have group sex. She also posted a strange picture of the book Lolita on a trash can in 2024. Okay, so yeah, they basically covered for him. And this is interesting. He allegedly hired a PR firm to flood social media with bot posts about his work to hide the story. He's been silent himself. He did write something recently. I think I have a picture of it, but I don't know if I really care to hear what he has to say. So he's the same U.S. lawyer as Russell Brand, Prince Andrew, and Danny Masterson. And also, I guess, Ezra Miller, who is evil, and Marilyn Manson as well. So what a great group. What a great group. What a great group of guys. I bet the tie that binds all of these people together, I mean, Danny Masterson, we know, is a Scientologist. And Scientology, I basically call sci-fi Satanism, because L. Ron Hubbard was very influenced by Aleister Crowley. And yeah, it's just all over it. It's just with an alien twist. So what else did I want to mention? What else? Let me see if anyone's here and take a sip of water, because I feel like I've been talking for half an hour straight. If you guys are making comments, I don't see any. Let me see. All right. Yeah, I don't see any. I guess people are just listening. Say hi if you're here. I'm going to take a sip of water. I don't know if I can see them or not. I don't know how I can even check. Anyway, I guess it doesn't matter. Oh, hey, what's up? Okay, so I can see comments, just people were just listening. That's awesome. Well, I had 6 people listening, so that's enough for me. As always, one would even be enough, but these are going to be here for you to listen to in the future. I was just talking about Scientology, so I'm looking back at my notes on my notepad. We talked a lot about Crowley already. Oh, there's a really disturbing part of the story here. Let me just share this tab instead. We'll go to the top so we can have his picture. Where he's sexually active in front of his son a few times. And Palmer asked the babysitter, was the kid wearing headphones? And it only makes me wonder, has this happened before? And so when we're on this sort of dark occult kind of tip here, we're often going to be talking about abuse of several different kinds. But I do believe that these people like to abuse children. And so I'm going to take us back a little bit to what I was talking about. James Wasserman, whose memoir I've read, he was an OTO member, and he would expose his children to rituals in his memoir. And I'm wondering, could this be what Gaiman was doing? I mean, yes, he's abusing his kid if the kid is present during these sexual acts. And in fact, the child had started calling the babysitter a slave. And so if it's not dark magic, it's definitely grooming, right? And abuse. And Gaiman, again, I said this earlier, but really admires Alan Moore, who has close connections or had close connections to the OTO and was actually interviewed by them several times for their Telemic publication. So I just wonder, you just have to wonder. Again, this is for entertainment purposes only. Let's see, what else? What else? Did I miss anything? Oh, remember, it ticks all my boxes. Male feminist is always a front for a fucked up dude. Okay, so he would say things. He would say things. Let me see if I can find it. He would say things like this, right? On a day like today, it's worth saying, I believe survivors, men must not close our eyes and minds to what happens to women in this world. We must fight alongside them for them to be believed at the ballot box and with art and by listening and change this world for the better. Amanda says, thank you for this amazing feminist AF husband. All men, all women, all artists, all hands on deck. This is getting serious. We need everyone. Well, you need to be like the writer of this Vulture piece and just excuse BDSM instead of condemn it. Again, I think BDSM is an excuse for abuse. Okay. He's a psychopath that may believe he has done nothing wrong. And I could go on and on. Like I've said, this ticks all the boxes. Society should rightly condemn BDSM. It's not normal. It's an excuse for sadists while being a proxy for self-harm on the masochistic side. Those are all my notes on my little pad. I'm wondering if I have any more insights on the printout. Oh, this was interesting. He spoke very slowly in a hypnotic way, says one of his former students, and I wrote NLP next to that, neuro-linguistic programming, which is something a lot of these personalities are able to do. Another example would be Keith Raniere, who was the Nexium cult leader that was also using, I believe, NLP on his victims in his cult. Let's see. So supposedly he has libraries full of books memorized. One of his old friends tells me, noting that he could recall the page numbers of his favorite passages and recite them verbatim. And so next to that, I wrote, he thinks this makes him superior. So this talks about the parasocial relationships he was having with his fans. Women would turn up to his signings dressed in the elaborate Victorian goth attire of his characters and beg him to sign their breasts or slip them key cards to hotel rooms. They wanted to be entwined with him in ways I was not prepared to defend him against. A woman fell to her knees and wept. Someone said people who flock to fantasy conventions and sightings make up an inherently vulnerable community. And I wrote a question mark next to that. And I mean, I guess I don't really understand that. Comic book nerds are inherently vulnerable. How? Because they live in a fantasy world? Like, I'm not really sure. But I guess it does explain itself here. It says they wrap themselves around a beloved text so it becomes their self-identity. And I wrote parasocial next to that. Let's see. There's a woman that kind of describes him as being charmingly goofy. Quote, he was hapless in a way that was kind of exasperating, but also made him seem very harmless. I wrote weaponized incompetence. A lot of men play that role, but they're not really sincerely this. And I really, truly think he's a psychopath who probably practices the dark arts and might be possessed by a demon. But hey, this is for entertainment purposes only. Once a fan asked if she could be his sex slave, and he read it out loud and said, well, no, he'd be very demure, according to this woman that worked with him. And then I wrote, because he or they, meaning like guys who are like this, they want to corrupt, right? They're not really interested in those who are already corrupted. It's part of their evil. They want to create corruption. They want to take something innocent and pure and then transmute it into something that is corrupted. He's a Scorpio. I wrote Scorpios underlined 3 times. He exhibits psychopathy and superficial charm. Quote, he would ask questions, laugh, and assure them that their inability to form sentences was fine. After the Sandman signing and a dinner attended by those who had worked the event, Gaiman sat next to Brenda. Everyone wanted to be near him. And I already read the part, but I'll read it one more time. As soon as these two, this is an early fan account, began to hook up, the feeling that had drawn her to him, the magical spell of his interest in her individuality vanished. And I wrote next to that because it was never real. And he wanted me to call him master immediately. He demanded that she promised him her soul. It was like he'd gone into this ritual that had nothing to do with me. I wrote demon in all caps. So I wrote reversal next to this. Although his books abounded with stories of men torturing, raping, and murdering women, this was largely perceived as evidence of his empathy, which again, believe people when they tell you who they are. Or rather when they show you through, if we're talking about artists, their work. So another woman says, I think this is a different one, but I'm just sort of skimming now my highlights. It's a very long piece. He said, I'm a very wealthy man and I'm used to getting what I want. Years later, he would give this woman $60,000 for therapy to make up for some damage. Let's see. According to a podcast which quoted Gaiman through his representatives, his position was that, quote, sexual degradation, bondage, domination, sadism, and masochism may not be to everyone's taste, but between consenting adults, BDSM is lawful. And I wrote, it's been completely normalized. And I think the only way to combat this is to bring a little bit of shame back to the culture. You know, this whole idea of kink shaming is like total trash. It's like, ew, you're gross. Stop. You're abusing people. Like, what's wrong with you? Get some therapy or something. And then this kind of domineering violence he inflicted on them is common among people who practice BDSM. This is the writer of the Vulture piece. And I said, yeah, it's common because it's been, again, normalized by this masochistic and I would argue godless culture. Again, we see the influence of Crowley, I think, throughout this. This writer will never condemn it. And I think it was this very magazine that published a story with a so-called trans man, a woman who amputated their breasts to quote unquote become male. Right. So then this author goes into this excuse. I just don't think there's any kind of line. I mentioned this. So I think I've said everything I want to say. If you want to read the piece, I have linked the archive version below. And I don't know, it's just really upsetting. And I think, again, the only way to combat this is to sort of blatantly talk about this for what it is instead of continuously making these excuses for these people and accepting them. And yeah, so it goes into sort of the Church of Scientology and how he was brought up in the Church of Scientology. So this is an interesting little tidbit from Going Clear. A story of a 4-year-old boy named Derek Green, an adopted black child who stole a Rolex and dropped it overboard. He was confined to the locker for 2 days and nights. I believe Neil Gaiman was probably abused. Right? We have that saying, hurt people. Hurt people is not an excuse. Okay. But, and it is not to paint the victims of abuse who, you know, may or may not become abusers themselves. Like that is not, I don't think, a typical thing, but I think it's a typical thing for these people to find each other and then do the so-called practice of BDSM. They seem to be drawn to these people. I wrote in the margins at one point, are these hurt people, these damaged people attracted to dark figures like Palmer and Gaiman? Let's see. Does trauma invite the demons in? Metaphorically, yes. Metaphysically, I also think possible. So Hubbard basically reminded the mother of this child, back to Going Clear, that, quote, the Scientology axiom that children are actually adults in small bodies, and equally responsible for the behavior. So again, Neil Gaiman was committing sexual acts in front of his child. I don't think that was the first time it had happened based on this comment by Amanda Palmer. Was he wearing headphones? Like, really strange comment. She also makes this comment at some point in this piece that this is all very like tedious and boring. Like, it's happened 14 times, but she doesn't even seem to mind, even though they're getting a divorce. Like, and apparently it's been very messy. According to this piece, she's now living again at home with her parents in Massachusetts. Although, according to her YouTube channel, she's about to go on tour in New Zealand again, I think. Anyway, so it talks about this book that he wrote that also has abuse in it, and it might also be him writing himself into his own work yet again. Let's see. He basically would endear himself to people like Douglas Adams, Arthur C. Clarke, Clive Barker. Okay, that's another one who's a complete and total Satanist, right? And Alan Moore. And I wrote other depraved men that wish to normalize their behavior. Anyway, I'm just like paging through, seeing if I wrote anything more interesting to share with you. These people prey on the vulnerable, right? This woman was homeless. She had lived on the beach homeless. And then she meets Amanda Palmer supposedly on the street. And Amanda Palmer sends her to the house when she knows the kid's not going to be there. And he will be? Like, what? It's just very weird. I just don't believe that she didn't knowingly put this person in danger. I wrote at one point, does this writer have any morals? I screamed no, Pavlovich says. Had Gaiman and Pavlovich been engaging in BDSM, this could conceivably have been part of a rape scene, a scenario sometimes described as consensual non-consent. Yes, this writer refuses to condemn this, which, might be a stylistic choice, but I feel like there's a lot more excuses for BDSM than there should be in this piece, and it's pretty awful. Anyway, guys, I hope you're having an awesome time doing whatever you're doing. I've been at this for almost an hour. Can you guys still hear me? Okay, I hope so. Why are all these cult leaders ugly dudes who think they're some kind of god of carnal knowledge? I don't know. I have no idea. I think it's just they're, ruled by demons or something. I mean, that's... yeah, they're always very unattractive weirdos, right? Like, I don't get it. I guess you could say that Russell Brand's attractive. Like, this whole thing also reminded me of Russell Brand. She told, so this is after Pavlovich comes to Amanda Palmer with this. She told her, I've had to do this before and I can do it again. I will take care of you. Pavlovich laid down in the bed and heard Palmer pacing back and forth in her room upstairs until 3 a.m. And I wrote, does Palmer like this? Russell Brand definitely has demonic eyes. He scares me. And again, it's that whole Crowleyan aesthetic, right? Do as thou wilt will be the whole of the law. I can't stand looking at him either. So then there's this guy that I'd like to look up in the future, but this is their supposedly like their marriage counselor. This guy named Mueller, who reached out to offer her Pavlovich safe harbor. This is the babysitter. And when they spoke on the phone, Pavlovich told Mueller what Gaiman, who was paying for the session, had asked her to say. After listening to Mueller's esoteric spiritual claptrap, she felt worse. Quote, she says, I really feel it was all my fault. Mueller, for his part, tells me that ethical boundaries prevent him from sharing anything about his sessions with Gaiman, but he apparently felt comfortable sharing details of his own conversation with Pavlovich. What she called to speak with me about was feeling pressured from very diverse, mostly older women in her community to take action that she wasn't sure she felt comfortable taking. I accompanied her on a journey to help her figure out the answers for herself on that issue. What does he mean by journey? I underline that. I want to look into this Mueller character. I'm very curious who this kook seems to be. Anyway, I think that's it for me. I think I've talked about everything I wanted to cover. I hope that was informative. And I really just think our culture needs to stop making excuses for these so-called practices like BDSM. I don't think there is a delineation. I think that the masochist is using it for a proxy for self-harm and someone's taking out their garbage. And I think the sadist is just a sadist, right? And I think both Gaiman and Palmer sound sort of like the sadistic types. And I have a hunch they're both really into the dark arts. So you've been listening to Dystopian Deep Dives. I hope you have an awesome time doing whatever you're doing. I'll catch you on the flip side. Good night. Oh, wait, one last comment before I go. I also could not get into Gaiman, similar to Neil Stevenson, was not able to see what made their work so lauded when it seemed so amateurish. It just seemed corny. He's corny. Amanda Palmer is corny. It made sense that they got together. Like, I remember that happening. But yeah, Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein for goths. Please read the piece. You know, it's really disturbing, but it's worth the look. And I guess we should all listen to Neil, right? Believe women. I hope everyone's having an awesome time doing whatever they're doing. And I'll catch you on the flip side. Take care.